Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Welcome back to Horror Night Whispers. Tonight, we turn our attention to the heartland, to the vast, quiet darkness of rural Ohio, where cornfields stretch for miles and the nearest neighbor is often nothing more than a distant porch light flickering through the trees. Out here, Halloween carries a different weight. The old traditions run deeper. The superstitions persist. And some things that walk the roads on the last night of October were never children at all. What you are about to hear has been reconstructed from a formal witness statement filed with the Licking County Sheriff's Department, supplemented by exterior surveillance footage, sleep study interviews conducted with 2 minors, and property transfer records documenting an unusually rapid sale. The homeowner in question served 31 years in law enforcement. He does not frighten easily. He does not embellish. And he has never returned to that house. If these accounts unsettle you, consider subscribing and leaving a comment. It helps others find their way to these files. Now, lower the lights. The first case begins. The property sat 3 miles outside of Granville, Ohio, accessible only by a single-lane gravel road that wound through a corridor of bare oaks and untended fields. Harold Brannick had purchased the land in 2004 following his early retirement from the County Sheriff's Department, 31 years of service. The last 12 as a deputy supervisor overseeing rural patrol routes that covered nearly 400 square miles of farmland, forest, and forgotten townships. He had seen death in many forms. He had pulled bodies from frozen creeks and photographed crime scenes in basements where the walls still held warmth from what had happened inside them. He was not a man given to superstition. He did not believe in ghosts. He believed in evidence, procedure, and the cold certainty of what could be documented and proven. His wife, Marlene, had passed in 2016. His 2 granddaughters, Lily, age 9, and Emma, age 7, had been living with him since the following spring, after their mother's struggles made continued custody impossible. The arrangement was quiet. The girls attended school in Granville. Harold drove them each morning in his old Ford F-150, packed their lunches with the same sandwiches he had made for himself during 3 decades of night shifts, and read to them each evening before bed. The house was small but solid. The woods pressed close on 3 sides, and every October, Harold set out a single bowl of candy on the porch for the few trick-or-treaters who made the drive out from town, usually no more than a dozen across the entire evening, their parents idling in cars at the end of the driveway while the children ran up to collect their share. On the night of October 31st, 2019, the last of those children arrived at 8:52 p.m. Harold noted the time because he always did. The porch light went off at 9. The candy bowl came inside. The girls were asleep by 9:30. Their bedroom door closed, a small nightlight glowing in the hallway. Harold settled into his recliner with the television on low, a habit from the years when silence had felt too much like waiting for a call that would drag him back out into the dark. He did not know he was being watched. The first indication came at 11:41 p.m. Harold had dozed off, the television still murmuring, when a flicker of motion on the security monitor mounted beside the front door pulled him back to wakefulness. He kept a 4-camera system, 1 covering the porch, 1 the driveway, and 2 on the rear corners of the property. The driveway camera showed only darkness and the faint outline of the gravel path leading out toward the road. Harold rubbed his eyes. He was about to look away when the motion sensor light at the end of the driveway clicked on. Something was standing there. He leaned closer to the monitor. The figure was small, a child, he assumed, perhaps 4 feet tall, standing motionless at the very edge of the light's reach. The image was grainy, the camera's night vision casting everything in a pale green wash, but he could make out the shape of a dress, old-fashioned and too large for the frame beneath it, the hem dragging against the gravel. The head was wrong. It took him a moment to understand why. The child appeared to be wearing a mask, a burlap sack perhaps, with 2 crude holes cut for the eyes. The fabric hung loose and uneven, obscuring any features beneath. Harold checked the time. 11:47 p.m. His first thought was practical. A lost child, separated from a group, wandering the back roads in search of help. It happened occasionally. The rural routes were poorly lit and easy to lose track of, especially for families from out of town who didn't know the area. He rose from his chair, pulled on his jacket, and retrieved the heavy flashlight from its hook beside the door. The night air hit him as he stepped onto the porch, colder than he expected, carrying the sharp edge of late autumn and something else beneath it, a stillness that pressed against his ears like cotton. The child had not moved. Harold walked down the porch steps and across the yard, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. The motion light at the end of the driveway clicked off as he passed beneath it, then flickered back on, casting his shadow long and wavering across the stones. He was within 20 feet of the figure now, close enough to see the details of the dress faded, stained, the fabric rotting along the seams in a way that suggested not costume but age, true age, the kind that came from decades folded in a trunk or buried in the earth. "Hey there," he called, his voice steady. "You lost? Your folks nearby?" The child did not respond. The head tilted slowly, unnaturally, the motion smooth and continuous, as if the neck contained no joints, no resistance. The mask's eye holes remained fixed on him, black and empty. Harold stopped. A pressure was building behind his temples, faint but persistent, and the cold had deepened, biting through his jacket and settling into his bones. He had felt this before once, years ago, at a crime scene in an abandoned farmhouse where 3 bodies had been found arranged in a circle on the kitchen floor. The air had carried the same weight, the same sense of being observed by something that did not breathe. "Can you hear me?" he asked. The child began to move, but the motion was wrong. She was walking backward, retreating toward the tree line without turning around, her bare feet sliding across the gravel in smooth, gliding steps. Her face, or the mask that covered it, remained locked on Harold, the tilt of the head unchanged. She passed from the reach of the motion light and into the shadows beneath the oaks. And still, she did not turn, did not look away, her small form receding into the black with the terrible patience of something that knew it would not be followed. Harold followed anyway. 30 feet, maybe more, his flashlight beam tracking the figure as it drifted deeper into the trees. The undergrowth crackled beneath his boots. Dead leaves carpeted the forest floor, brittle and dry, and then he saw it. The child's feet were not touching the ground. She hovered roughly 3 inches above the leaves, her bare soles pale and motionless, the hem of her dress hanging straight down as if weighted. There was no bobbing, no adjustment for terrain. She simply floated, retreating into the darkness with the same gliding smoothness. The mask still fixed on him, the eye holes black and absolute. Harold's flashlight trembled. He opened his mouth to call out again and froze. The child's mouth opened behind the burlap. The fabric shifted, pushed outward from within by something that moved beneath it. And then his own voice emerged from that darkness, word for word, syllable for syllable, a perfect mimicry. "Can you hear me?" The sound was not an echo. It was his voice, torn from his throat and worn by something else, played back with a precision that made his stomach clench. The child tilted her head the other way, the motion slow and deliberate, and the mouth opened again. "You lost? Your folks nearby?" Harold ran. He did not remember crossing the yard. He did not remember climbing the porch steps. He was inside, the door locked, the deadbolt thrown, his back pressed against the wood, and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The flashlight was still in his hand, the beam pointed at the floor. And for a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. The house was silent. The television murmured in the living room. The hallway nightlight glowed soft and orange, and then something moved outside. Harold turned to the security monitor. The cameras showed the yard, the driveway, the edge of the tree line all empty. But as he watched, a burst of static rippled across the screen covering the north side of the house. A shape passed through the frame, small and dark, moving with that same gliding smoothness. The static followed it, erasing the figure's face, leaving only the outline of the dress and the trailing hem. The shape moved out of frame. Seconds later, another burst of static crossed the east camera. The same shape, the same glide. It was circling the house. For 4 hours, Harold watched. He checked on the girls twice, both asleep, undisturbed, their breathing slow and even. He sat in the hallway between their door and the front of the house, the flashlight in one hand and his old service revolver in the other, though he did not know what good either would do. The shape passed each window in sequence, patient and relentless, the cameras capturing only static where its face should have been. It never tried the doors. It never tested the windows. It simply circled, over and over, as if waiting for something to change. At 4:03 a.m., the circling stopped. Harold was still in the hallway, his eyes heavy, his grip on the revolver loose, when the sound came. A single knock, soft, almost polite, from the girl's bedroom door. From inside the room, he was on his feet before the sound had finished. The door wrenched open, the flashlight beam sweeping across the beds. Lily and Emma were both sitting up, their eyes wide and glassy, their faces pale in the sudden light. They were unharmed. They were awake, and they were staring at the window on the far side of the room, where the curtains hung still and the glass reflected only darkness. "Grandpa," Lily whispered. Her voice was thin, trembling. There was a girl. She was wearing a mask. She was at the window. She wanted to come in. Emma nodded, her small hands clutching the blanket to her chest. "She asked us. In the dream. She said she was cold. She said she just wanted to play." Harold checked the window. Locked. The screen intact. No marks on the glass. No prints in the frost that had gathered on the sill. He checked the closet, the space beneath the beds, the corners where the shadows pooled thick and dark. But when he turned back to the girls, both of them were looking at him with an expression he had seen before, on witnesses, on victims, on the faces of people who had seen something that would never fully leave them. "She said she'd come back," Emma whispered. "She said she always comes back." The Brannick family moved out of the property 6 weeks later. Harold sold the house at a significant loss to a young couple from Columbus who did not ask about its history. He took the girls to live with his sister in Pennsylvania, and according to county records, he has not returned to Licking County since. The new owners have since filed 3 separate reports with local authorities, each describing the same incident. A child standing at the end of the driveway on Halloween night, motionless, wearing an oversized burlap mask with crude eye holes and a faded dress that does not belong to any era they recognize. The figure appears at 11:47 p.m., remains visible for approximately 3 minutes, and retreats into the tree line without turning around. No missing child report in the state of Ohio matches the description. No historical records identify a child's death on or near the property. The land itself was farmland in the 1,840 seconds, part of a small homestead that burned in 1847 under circumstances never fully explained. What knocked on that bedroom door remains unknown. What circled that house for 4 hours has never been identified. And every year, on the last night of October, something still waits at the end of that gravel road, patient, silent, and unchanging. It is possible that it will wait forever. The archives exhale another breath, colder this time, heavier with implication. What follows was extracted from Ashland Police Department records, cross-referenced with emergency dispatch logs, university counseling reports, and witness testimonies collected across a 3-year period. The case remains officially classified as a voluntary missing person investigation, though internal notes suggest something more disturbing was dismissed for lack of physical evidence. The costume itself was never recovered. The thrift store closed permanently in March 2023, its inventory donated to an undisclosed location. What Marcus Weir experienced between October 28th and November 15th, 2021, has been reconstructed from security footage, text message records, medical evaluations, and the increasingly fractured statements he gave to friends, campus security, and ultimately, no one at all. This is what the record shows. The thrift store on Winchester Avenue had the particular smell of old fabric and donated live, stale perfume, cigarette smoke absorbed into polyester, the chemical tang of mothballs. Marcus Weir found the costume on a wire rack near the back, wedged between a vampire cape and a deflated, inflatable dinosaur. The clown suit was vintage, genuinely so, not the mass-produced polyester garbage flooding every Spirit Halloween in October. The fabric was heavy cotton, hand-stitched in places, the colors somehow richer than they should have been after decades. The mask was porcelain smooth, painted with exaggerated features, wide blue eyes, red cheeks, a grin that stretched from ear to ear in traditional circus fashion. The price tag read $12. Marcus bought it without trying it on. The cashier, a woman in her 60s named Dolores Finch, later told police she had been relieved to see it go. She did not elaborate when asked why. Store records, obtained through subpoena after Marcus disappeared, revealed a pattern that Dolores had either forgotten or chosen not to mention. The costume had been donated to the store 3 separate times since 1987. Each time, it was returned within 4 days, sometimes less. No names attached to the returns, only dates stamped on the intake forms. October 31st, 1987. November 2nd, 1994. October 30th, 2003. Each donation marked as anonymous. Each return processed without explanation. The costume placed back on the rack, waiting. Marcus carried it home in a plastic bag and hung it in his closet. He lived in a duplex off Roberts Drive with his roommate, Tyler Mathis, a computer science major who spent most evenings gaming with headphones on. Tyler later stated he never saw Marcus bring the costume into the apartment, though he confirmed it was hanging in Marcus's room by October 29th. Marcus had mentioned the Halloween party in passing something low-key at a friend's house, a chance to blow off steam before midterms. Tyler said Marcus seemed fine, normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing alarming. He did not notice anything unusual about the costume when he glimpsed it through Marcus's doorway. Just a clown suit on a hanger. The party was held at a rental house on Blackburn Avenue, hosted by a senior named Chloe Brennan. Approximately 30 people attended. Marcus arrived at 9:47 p.m., confirmed by doorbell camera footage obtained later. He was wearing the costume, the mask tucked under his arm when he walked in. Several attendees later described him as quiet that night, more reserved than usual, though no one could pinpoint when he actually put the mask on. Chloe remembered seeing him in full costume by 10:30 p.m., standing near the kitchen, holding a beer he never drank. She said he kept adjusting the mask, tugging at it like it fit too tight, though when she asked if he was okay, he just nodded and stepped outside for air. The photographs began circulating almost immediately. College parties generate hundreds of photos, group shots, candid moments, blurry images taken by people too drunk to hold a phone steady. Marcus appeared in 17 separate photos that night, taken by 8 different people on 6 different phones. The images were reviewed extensively after he vanished, and the inconsistency became impossible to ignore. In the first photo, taken at 10:52 p.m., the painted smile on the mask is wide but proportional, the eyes bright blue with standard highlights. In the second photo, taken at 11:14 p.m. by a different person from a different angle, the smile is noticeably wider, stretching slightly past the original edges of the painted area. The blue of the eyes appears darker, almost navy. By the fifth photo, taken at 11:48 p.m., the smile has extended further, curling upward in a way that doesn't match the mask's original design. The eyes are black, reflecting light strangely, like wet glass. No one noticed at the time. The lighting was bad, the photos were taken quickly, and everyone was drinking. But when the images were compiled and examined chronologically, the progression was undeniable. Something in the mask was changing, or something was changing the mask. Marcus himself appeared increasingly stiff in later photos, his posture rigid, his hands hanging motionless at his sides. In one image taken at 12:33 a.m., he is standing alone in the hallway, facing the camera, though no one remembered taking the picture. The smile on the mask is grotesquely wide, the painted grin now extending onto the fabric of the hood itself, as if drawn in something wet. Marcus told Chloe he needed the bathroom at 1:15 a.m. She pointed him toward the hallway. He walked in that direction, still wearing the mask. He did not come back. At 1:34 a.m., Tyler received a text from Marcus. Outside. Need air. Don't wait up. Tyler, still at his own gathering across town, did not think much of it. But when Chloe checked the bathroom at 1:40 a.m. and found it empty, she started asking around. No one had seen Marcus leave. His coat was still on the rack. His car was still parked on the street. Someone checked the backyard. They found him standing at the edge of the property, just before the tree line, facing the woods. He was still wearing the costume. The mask was still on. He did not move when they called his name. Two friends, Adam Keeler and Jennifer Ruiz, approached him cautiously, calling out, waving their hands in front of his face. He did not respond. His breathing was shallow, regular, but his body was locked in place. Arms loose at his sides, head tilted slightly forward. They tried to pull him back toward the house, but he resisted, feet planted, still staring into the dark spaces between the trees. It took 3 of them to move him. They half-carried him inside, sat him down on the couch, pulled the mask off. His face underneath was pale, slick with sweat, his eyes wide and unblinking. He started talking immediately, the words coming too fast, overlapping. His voice hoarse, as if he had been screaming. He said he had seen someone in the woods. Someone wearing the same costume, the exact same costume, down to the stitching, the colors, the mask. The figure had been standing just beyond the fence, 20 feet into the trees, watching him. Marcus said the figure had smiled at him, not just the painted smile, but something underneath, something moving beneath the porcelain. And then it had waved, a slow, deliberate wave, fingers spreading wide, beckoning. Marcus said he had waved back. He did not know why. He said it felt automatic, like something pulling his hand up without his permission. And the moment he waved, the figure started running. Not walking, not jogging, running, impossibly fast, weaving between trees with fluid, inhuman speed, closing the distance in seconds. Marcus said he could hear it, the sound of feet pounding the ground, the rustle of fabric, something wet slapping against wood. He said he tried to move, tried to turn and run back to the house, but his legs would not respond. He stood there, locked in place, watching it come closer, watching the smile grow wider, watching the eyes inside the mask shift and focus on him with terrible clarity. And then it stopped. 10 feet away, just outside the fence line. Still smiling, still watching. Marcus said it reached up slowly and touched its own face, fingers pressing into the painted cheeks, and he heard a sound, soft, wet, like fabric tearing. And then his friends were pulling him backward, dragging him inside, and he lost sight of it. Chloe called campus security. They arrived at 2:03 a.m. and found Marcus coherent but shaking, wrapped in a blanket, refusing to go back outside. They took a statement, walked the perimeter of the property, found nothing unusual. No footprints in the mud near the tree line. No disturbances in the woods. They noted Marcus smelled strongly of alcohol and suggested he sleep it off. Chloe drove him home at 2:47 a.m. Tyler was already asleep. Marcus did not wake him. The next morning, Marcus burned the costume in the duplex's backyard fire pit. Tyler watched from the kitchen window, later stating that Marcus stood over the flames for nearly an hour, even after the fabric had turned to ash. Tyler said Marcus kept poking at the remnants with a stick, spreading the ashes, making sure nothing remained intact. The mask took the longest to burn. The porcelain cracked in the heat, pieces splitting off, but the paint seemed to resist, bubbling and blackening but not disappearing. When it was finally over, Marcus came inside, showered, and spent the rest of the day in his room with the door locked. Over the next 3 days, Tyler heard Marcus talking in his sleep, not mumbling talking, clear and deliberate, though the words were nonsense, repeated phrases that made no sense. On November 1st, Tyler recorded one of these episodes on his phone. In the recording, Marcus's voice is flat, emotionless, repeating the same phrase over and over for 6 minutes. "It's still wearing me. It's still wearing me. It's still wearing me." Tyler tried to wake him, but Marcus did not respond until the phrase stopped, at which point he opened his eyes and asked what time it was, seemingly unaware he had been speaking at all. Marcus stopped attending classes. He stopped answering texts. Tyler said he would leave the apartment at odd hours, midnight, 3 a.m., 5 a.m., and return hours later, dirty, sometimes wet, always exhausted. When Tyler asked where he had been, Marcus would say he was walking, just walking. On November 7th, Marcus's academic advisor filed a welfare check request with campus security after Marcus missed an exam and did not respond to emails. Security knocked on the duplex door at 11:30 a.m. on November 9th. Tyler let them in. Marcus's room was empty. His phone, wallet, and keys were on the dresser. His bed had not been slept in. Tyler called the police. A missing person report was filed on November 10th. Marcus's parents drove up from Louisville, stayed for a week, distributed flyers, gave interviews to local news. Security footage from campus showed Marcus leaving the duplex on foot at 2:14 a.m. on November 9th, wearing jeans and a hoodie, walking south on Roberts Drive. He did not appear on any other cameras. His phone's last location ping was registered at 2:31 a.m. near the intersection of Winchester and 14th Street, 2 blocks from the thrift store. The investigation stalled. No financial activity. No social media use. No sightings confirmed by police. Marcus's case was entered into the national database and marked as voluntary missing, though his parents contested the classification. They hired a private investigator who found nothing new. The case went cold. On October 19th, 2022, nearly a year after Marcus disappeared, a woman named Patricia Holbrook filed a report with Ashland PD. She stated that at approximately 11:43 p.m. on October 18th, she had driven past the thrift store on Winchester Avenue and seen a man standing on the sidewalk outside the front door. The store had been closed for months, the windows papered over, but the man was standing directly beneath the broken awning, facing the glass. Patricia slowed her car to get a better look. She said the man was young, thin, wearing dark clothing, and he was smiling. Not a natural smile, a painted smile, stretched too wide, carved into his face, white and red and grotesque. She said he turned his head to watch her car pass, the smile never changing, his eyes catching the streetlight in a way that made them look black and reflective. Patricia provided a description that matched Marcus Weir's driver's license photo. Police returned to the thrift store, found it still abandoned, searched the interior, and found no evidence of entry or habitation. The case remained open but inactive. The thrift store was demolished in April 2024. The property was sold to a developer planning a mixed-use retail space. During demolition, workers reported finding a crawl space beneath the back storage room that did not appear on the original building plans. Inside the crawl space, they found remnants of fabric, old and rotted, along with fragments of painted porcelain. No official inventory was taken. The debris was cleared with the rest of the site. Marcus Weir has not been seen again. His case file remains accessible through public records request, though most of the supplementary materials, including the photographs from the Halloween party, have been removed for privacy reasons. The Ashland Police Department declined to comment on the specifics of the investigation when contacted. Tyler Mathis graduated in 2023 and moved out of state. Chloe Brennan graduated the same year and did not respond to interview requests. The last known piece of evidence is a voicemail left on Tyler's phone on October 31st, 2023, at 3:07 a.m. The number was unlisted. The message contains no words, only breathing slow, steady, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of something wet scraping against fabric. The recording lasts 41 seconds. Tyler gave the recording to police, then changed his number. He has not received another call. The costume has not resurfaced. The thrift store's final inventory records requested through Freedom of Information protocols, list no clown costumes among the donations processed between 2020 and 2023. What became of Marcus Weir remains unknown. What he wore into the woods that November night remains unconfirmed. But the records end the same way they begin, with absence, with silence, with something still unaccounted for. The veil between stories grows thinner. What follows emerged from testimony sealed by court order, witnesses who saw what should not exist. On Halloween night 2017, in southern Indiana's rolling farmland, 14 people boarded the third wagon of the Branson family's annual haunted hayride, expecting manufactured scares and autumn tradition. What they encountered in an unmapped grove called Willow Hollow would end the 43-year operation permanently and leave investigators with accounts that matched too perfectly to dismiss, too impossibly to explain. The incident report, obtained through a Freedom of Information request 3 years after the fact, contains statements from all 14 passengers, the tractor driver, and 2 emergency responders who treated the victims for symptoms of extreme psychological shock. Each account describes the same figures, the same movements, the same impossible woman with no jaw. This reconstruction draws from those sealed testimonies, medical records, and one fragmentary police interview with Dean Fitch before he left Indiana and severed all contact with authorities. The Branson property remains operational as a corn maze and pumpkin patch. Willow Hollow remains fenced, padlocked, and removed from all family tour routes. The Branson farm sprawled across 200 acres of southern Indiana hardwood forest and cleared pasture, a patchwork of corn stubble and dense tree lines that turned spectacular gold and crimson every October. For 43 years, the family had operated their Halloween hayride as a local institution, tractors pulling open wagons through marked trails, populated by teenage actors in rubber masks and strategically placed fog machines. The route never varied. 3 wagons ran simultaneously on staggered schedules, each following the same orange-painted stakes that wound through the property's eastern woodland section, a carefully maintained path that took approximately 30 minutes to complete. The Bransons knew every acre of their land. They knew which sections flooded in spring, where the deer paths crossed, which stands of timber had been planted by their grandfather in 1952. They did not operate tours through Willow Hollow. They had never operated tours through Willow Hollow. That section of the property, a depression thick with ancient willow trees and wild grapevine, approximately 6 acres in total, had been excluded from family use for 3 generations. The reason, passed down but never formally documented, was simple. The ground there felt wrong. Dean Fitch had been driving tractors for the Branson hayride for 2 seasons. 24 years old, reliable, comfortable with machinery and night work. On Halloween 2017, he piloted the third wagon of the evening, departing the barn staging area at 9:47 p.m. with 14 passengers seated on hay bales, arranged along the wagon's sides. The night was clear, temperature in the low 50s, moon 3/4 full. The passengers were a mix, families with children, teenagers, 2 couples in their 60s. Standard October crowd. Dean followed the marked trail as he had done 30 times that season. Tractor headlights cutting through manufactured fog pumped from hidden machines, speakers mounted on the wagon playing a pre-recorded loop of chains, rattling, and distant screams. At the 15-minute mark, the trail curved north around a stand of hickory trees. Dean turned the wheel. The tractor followed. But the orange stakes that should have continued ahead were no longer visible. The first passenger to notice the change was Helen Cray, a nurse from Bloomington seated near the wagon's rear gate. She would later tell investigators that the temperature dropped dramatically within seconds, not gradually, but as though they had passed through a threshold into winter air. The manufactured fog disappeared. The speaker system cut to silence mid-scream, which moments before had been spaced according to the Bransons' careful trail maintenance. Now pressed close on both sides, branches forming a canopy that blocked the moon. Helen looked for the orange trail markers. Gone. She looked back the way they had come. The path behind them had vanished into darkness so complete it seemed solid. She turned to the woman beside her, a schoolteacher named Monica Pruitt, and saw her own confusion reflected. Monica was staring at the trees. Helen followed her gaze and saw movement between the trunks. The figures appeared gradually, as though stepping from behind barriers that did not exist. Tall, over 6 feet, possibly 7. Emaciated to the point of skeletal structure, visible beneath clothing. The clothing itself seemed wrong, antique in cut and fabric, dark, formal wear rotted to threads in places. Helen's training as a medical professional made her catalog details automatically. Proportions slightly off, limbs too long, joints bending at angles that suggested either severe deformity or something fundamentally inhuman. But it was the faces that stopped rational assessment. Pale, not Caucasian pale, but bloodless, wax figure pale. Eyes that reflected the tractor's headlights like animal eyes. Flat, silver discs without pupils. And all of them, Helen counted 9 initially, then 12, then lost count as more, emerged, moved in perfect synchronization with the wagon's progress. Dean did not see them at first. His attention was fixed on navigating what he assumed was a section of trail temporarily obscured by equipment malfunction or prank. But the tractor's engine sounded different here, laboring as though pulling through mud despite the ground appearing solid. He glanced at the fuel gauge, the temperature indicator, found nothing wrong. Then, a teenage boy in the wagon's middle section, identified in police records as Marcus Webb, age 16, shouted a question Dean could not pass over the engine noise. Dean looked back, saw his passengers' faces, saw where they were staring, saw the figures pacing the wagon through the trees. They never came closer than 15 feet, never fell behind despite the tractor maintaining steady speed, never made sound. Helen Cray, whose statement is the most detailed of the 14, described their movement as gliding feet touching ground but not disturbing leaves, not snapping branches, not behaving as physical bodies should when moving through forest undergrowth. One figure, slightly ahead of the others, wore what appeared to be a woman's dress from the late 1800s, black fabric hanging in tatters, her head turned to track the wagon, neck rotating further than human anatomy allowed. Another, male in build, had one arm extended as though reaching, fingers impossibly long, mouth open in an expression that might have been anguish or hunger. A third was small, child-sized, but with the same wrong proportions and reflective eyes. Marcus Webb pulled out his phone, activated the camera, held it toward the figures and watched them through the screen as he recorded. Later, when he reviewed the footage, he would find 12 minutes of blurred white streaks against black background. No shapes, no definition, nothing but motion suggesting something present the camera could not properly capture. But in the moment, he could see them clearly with his naked eyes. Everyone could. The family beside Marcus, parents and 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11, huddled together, the father wrapping both children in his arms. The couples in their 60s sat rigid, one woman gripping her husband's hand hard enough that he would later show investigators the bruises. No one screamed. Helen remembered that detail specifically. In 43 years of Branson hay rides, wagons full of passengers always screamed. It was part of the experience. But in Willow Hollow, no one made a sound beyond breathing harsh, rapid. The sound of bodies recognizing threat at a primal level. The tractor pulled them deeper into trees that should not have existed on this part of the Branson property. Dean tried turning the wheel, tried forcing the vehicle back toward where the main trail should have been. The tractor continued forward as though following rails. The figures multiplied. 20 now, 30, emerging from darkness that seemed to generate them rather than merely conceal them. And still that perfect, synchronized movement, pacing, watching. Faces turned toward the wagon with expressions that were not quite expressions. Features arranged in approximations of human emotion, but lacking something essential. Some spark of life or consciousness that makes a face readable. At 10:31 p.m., recorded precisely by Marcus Webb's phone before the camera became useless, the tractor engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed, simply ceased as though a switch had been thrown. Momentum carried the wagon forward several feet before friction stopped them completely. Dean turned the ignition. Nothing. Tried again. Dead silence. Then he became aware of passengers behind him making sounds, not screams, but sharp intakes of breath, the kind of involuntary noise the body makes when confronted with immediate physical threat. He turned in his seat. A figure stood on the wagon bed among the passengers. Helen Cray sat closest, near enough to see every detail she would later describe in her statement with the precision of someone documenting medical findings. Female form, tall, wearing burial clothes, formal dress of black silk, now gray with age, high collar, long sleeves. But the face had no lower jaw. The skull ended at the cheekbones. Below that was absence, a black void that did not behave like shadow or empty space, but rather like a tear in reality, a hole through which nothing could be seen except more darkness. The figure's eyes were open, fixed, reflecting Dean's headlights. She was not transparent, not insubstantial, solid enough to stand on the wagon bed, solid enough that her weight made the wood creak. She raised one hand, extended one finger, and pointed at the father holding his daughters. He stiffened, face going gray. She held her finger on him for 5 seconds, 10, then moved to the next passenger, the elderly woman, pointed, held, moved on. The schoolteacher, Monica Pruitt, pointed, held, moved on. She went through all 14 passengers, pointing at each in turn, fingers steady, that impossible face void angled down toward them as though studying specimens, cataloging, recording. When she pointed at Marcus Webb, he felt cold, so intense he thought his lungs would freeze. When she pointed at Helen Cray, Helen smelled earth and something underneath the earth, decay sweetened by minerals and root systems. The woman with no jaw completed her circuit of the passengers, lowered her hand, and vanished. Not faded, not walked away, simply ceased to be present in the space she had occupied. The tractor engine started. Dean had not touched the ignition. The headlights flared bright enough to make the passengers shield their eyes, then settled to normal intensity. The trees ahead parted not physically, but as though a curtain had drawn back and revealed the orange trail markers, clearly visible, leading back to the main route. Dean did not hesitate. He accelerated, tractor surging forward with more speed than it should have been capable of, wagon bouncing over ground that felt suddenly normal, rocks and roots and ordinary earth. The synchronized figures did not follow. Helen looked back once and saw them standing motionless between the willows, watching. Then the trees closed behind the wagon, and there was only normal forest, normal October darkness, normal manufactured fog beginning to creep back through the underbrush. The wagon emerged onto the main trail at 10:38 p.m. The entire deviation had lasted 19 minutes. Dean drove directly back to the barn, bypassing the remaining scheduled route. As the wagon pulled into the staging area's floodlights, the Branson family saw their passengers' faces and immediately called emergency services. All 14 people were present, physically unharmed, but unable to speak, not choosing silence, unable, as though language had temporarily left them. Paramedics treated them for shock, recorded elevated heart rates and blood pressure, noted pupils dilated beyond normal fear response. Speech returned gradually over the following 3 hours, starting with single words, progressing to full sentences. But none of the passengers could explain the mechanism of their silence, only that their throats had not worked, their mouths had not formed words. Dean Fitch spoke to police once, gave a statement matching the passengers' accounts in every essential detail, then requested they not contact him again. He left Indiana 2 weeks later. Attempts to reach him for follow-up interviews went unanswered. The Branson family discontinued the hayride immediately, issuing refunds for the remainder of the season and announcing permanent closure. They fenced Willow Hollow with 8-foot chain link, added padlocks, posted no trespassing signs. When investigators asked to examine the section, the family refused. Their lawyer cited property rights and liability concerns. The request was not pursued. Searches of county records revealed burials on the Branson property in the 1,870 seconds. a family cemetery, common for the period, containing 17 graves. The cemetery's location was not precisely documented in surviving records, but property surveys from 1889 note burial ground, Willow Grove, Eastern Acreage. Attempts to locate the graves using ground-penetrating radar were denied by the family. The investigation closed without formal conclusions. The official report lists the incident as group anxiety event, environmental disorientation, mass suggestion. Helen Cray, contacted 2 years after the event, stands by her testimony. So do the other 13 passengers still willing to discuss it. Marcus Webb's phone video remains the only attempted physical evidence. It shows nothing investigators can identify. The hayride never resumed. Willow Hollow remains undisturbed. The archives refuse to stay closed. What follows was found in a sealed evidence locker in Rockingham County, attached to a missing persons case that predates most living memory. In the autumn of 2020, Corinne Walsh lived in a narrow 2-story colonial on Ash Street in Derry, New Hampshire, where the maple trees formed tunnels of orange and red above cracked sidewalks, and the evening air carried the sharp mineral scent of approaching winter. She was 43 years old, a dental hygienist at the community clinic, and for 20 years she had maintained the same Halloween tradition, carving a single jack-o'-lantern on the afternoon of October 30th, placing it on the wooden porch rail with a tea light inside, and leaving it to glow through both nights of the holiday. It was a ritual passed down from her mother, simple and unbroken, and Corinne found comfort in its repetition. The pumpkin she selected that year was medium-sized, slightly oblong, with a pale orange skin that felt cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She carved it at the kitchen table, while her husband Derek worked late at the hardware store, using the same paring knife she always used, creating the traditional design: 2 triangular eyes, an inverted triangle for a nose, and a jagged semicircle smile. The pumpkin looked unremarkable, harmless. She set it on the porch at dusk, lit the candle, and watched it flicker through the front window before going to bed. At 2:14 a.m., Corinne woke to light. Not the pale glow of street lamps or passing headlights, but a specific orange radiance that filled her bedroom with the flickering warmth of candlelight. She opened her eyes slowly, disoriented, her mind still half submerged in sleep. The light was coming from her left, from the window that overlooked the front yard. She turned her head. The jack-o'-lantern sat on the interior windowsill, its carved face glowing steadily, the tea light inside still burning. For several seconds, she simply stared at it, her thoughts struggling to connect. The pumpkin had been on the porch. She had seen it there before bed. Now, it was inside her bedroom, on the second floor. She sat up slowly, her heart beginning to accelerate. Derek lay beside her, motionless, his breathing deep and rhythmic. She reached over and shook his shoulder. He groaned, rolled toward her, his face slack with sleep. "Did you bring the pumpkin inside?" she whispered. He blinked at her, confused. "What?" "The jack-o'-lantern. It's on the windowsill." He turned his head, squinted at the glowing shape. "I didn't touch it. I've been asleep." Corinne climbed out of bed and approached the pumpkin. The carved face stared back at her, its triangular eyes dark and hollow, the candlelight flickering behind them. The smell was stronger, now earthy, vegetal, with an undercurrent of something slightly sour. She picked it up carefully, feeling the waxy heat of the candle through the thin walls of the gourd. It was the same pumpkin. She was certain. The carving matched exactly. She carried it downstairs, Derek following behind her in his boxer shorts, rubbing his eyes. The front door was locked from the inside, the deadbolt engaged. They checked every window on the first floor. All locked. No signs of entry, no disturbance. Derek shrugged, yawning. "Maybe you moved it and forgot. You were tired." Corinne said nothing. She set the pumpkin back on the porch rail, blew out the candle, and returned to bed. But she did not sleep. She lay awake in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, listening to Derek's breathing return to its steady rhythm, and watching the window. The orange glow did not return. Morning came slowly, gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Corinne went to work. She cleaned teeth, took x-rays, smiled at patients, and did not mention the pumpkin. When she returned home that evening, Halloween night, the jack-o'-lantern sat where she had left it, unlit, its carved face shadowed and lifeless. She considered throwing it away. Instead, she relit the candle as the sun set, honoring the tradition one more night. That was all. She woke at 2:14 a.m. The light was closer this time, much closer. Corinne opened her eyes and found herself staring directly into the carved face of the jack-o'-lantern. It sat on her nightstand, inches from her head, the candle inside still burning. The triangular eyes were level with her own. For a long moment, she could not move. Her body felt paralyzed, her lungs locked, her thoughts spiraling into incoherence. The pumpkin had moved again. It had come upstairs again, but this time it had been placed beside her, positioned deliberately, intimately, as if something had carried it to her bedside and set it down to watch her sleep. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to sit up. The carved face looked different. The triangular eyes seemed wider than she remembered, the edges of the cuts more jagged, as if something had clawed at them from the inside. The mouth, the jagged semicircle smile, now curved downward at the edges, twisting into an expression that resembled a scream more than a grin. She leaned closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. The candlelight flickered. And then she saw it. Movement. Inside the hollowed cavity of the pumpkin, behind the candle flame, something was shifting, something wet. The interior walls of the gourd glistened as if coated in mucus, and within that glistening darkness, she could see shapes pressing outward, pushing against the inner surface. Fingers, small fingers, they flexed and curled, leaving streaks in the wet membrane, and then withdrew back into the shadows. Corinne screamed. She grabbed the pumpkin and hurled it away from her. It hit the floor with a dull, wet thud, the candle extinguishing instantly, plunging the room into darkness. Derek woke with a shout, fumbling for the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room. The jack-o'-lantern lay on its side near the door, motionless. Corinne was shaking, her hands pressed against her mouth. "There's something inside it," she whispered. "There's something inside." Derek stared at her, then at the pumpkin. He climbed out of bed and approached it cautiously, crouching down. He tilted it upright, peering into the carved openings. "It's just a pumpkin, Corinne. There's nothing inside. I saw it. There were fingers, moving." He reached inside, his hand disappearing into the hollow interior. He pulled out the tea light, the wick blackened and cold. See, empty, just seeds and pulp. But Corinne would not look. She pulled the blankets around herself and turned away, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Derek carried the pumpkin downstairs and threw it into the large trash bin behind the house. He came back to bed and held her until dawn, telling her it was stress, that she had been dreaming, that everything was fine. She did not argue, but she did not sleep. The morning of November first arrived cold and bright, the sky scrubbed clean by overnight winds. Corinne stayed home from work, exhausted, her nerves raw. Derek left for the hardware store at 8, kissing her forehead and telling her to rest. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. At 9:30, she heard Derek's truck pull back into the driveway. The engine cut off. The truck door slammed. Footsteps on the porch. The front door opened. Derek stood in the entryway, his face pale, holding the jack-o'-lantern in both hands. "It was on the porch," he said quietly. Corinne stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. "That's impossible." "I know." He set the pumpkin on the kitchen table. It looked the same oblong shape, the same pale orange skin. But the carved expression had changed again. The triangular eyes were now elongated, stretched upward as if in surprise or terror. The mouth, the twisted, screaming mouth, was wider. the jagged edges more pronounced. And embedded in that carved grin, pressed into the orange flesh along the lower edge, were teeth. Real teeth. Human teeth. 6 of them. Small, child-sized. Each one slightly yellowed, the roots dark and exposed, pushed into the pumpkin's flesh as if the gourd had grown around them. Corinne backed away from the table, her hand covering her mouth. Derek stared at the teeth, his jaw slack. Neither of them spoke. The teeth glistened faintly in the morning light, organic and wrong, a biological intrusion into the vegetable matter. Corinne could see the ridges on the enamel, the tiny imperfections, the unmistakable reality of them. After a long silence, Derek pulled out his phone and called the police. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, a younger man named Officer Brennan and an older woman named Sergeant Levesque. They examined the pumpkin carefully, photographing it from multiple angles, taking measurements, asking questions. How long had Corinne owned the pumpkin? Where had she purchased it? Had anyone else been in the house? Were there signs of forced entry? Corinne answered mechanically, her voice flat. She did not mention the movement she had seen inside. She did not mention the fingers. Sergeant Levesque used gloved hands to carefully extract the teeth, placing each one in a separate evidence bag. She promised they would send them for analysis. Derek provided a written statement. The officers took the pumpkin itself, sealing it in a large plastic evidence bag. They told Corinne and Derek they would be in touch. 3 days later, Sergeant Levesque returned. She sat in the living room, her expression carefully neutral, and told them the results. The teeth had been analyzed by a forensic odontologist. They belonged to a child, approximately 7 to 9 years old. Dental records had been checked against missing persons cases in New Hampshire. There was a match. The teeth belonged to a boy named Timothy Marsh, who had disappeared from Derry on October 28th, 1987. He had been trick-or-treating in the neighborhood near Ash Street when he vanished. His body was never found. The case remained open, unsolved, classified as a suspected abduction. The teeth showed no signs of recent removal. The roots were degraded, the enamel aged, consistent with remains that had been buried or hidden for decades. How they had come to be embedded in a pumpkin carved in 2020 was unexplained. Sergeant Levesque asked if Corinne or Derek had any connection to the Marsh family, to the 1987 case, to anything that might explain the presence of the teeth. Both said no. Levesque left her card and told them to call if they remembered anything else. The case was reopened. No further evidence was found. No arrests were made. Corinne never carved another pumpkin. She refused to discuss what she had seen moving inside the jack-o'-lantern, refused to elaborate on the wet, glistening interior, the small fingers pressing outward. When pressed by Derek, by investigators, by her own sister, she would only shake her head and say she did not want to remember. In the months that followed, neighbors on Ash Street noticed changes. Corinne stopped going outside after dark. She had blackout curtains installed on every window in the house, heavy fabric that blocked out all light. Each October, as Halloween approached, she would leave town entirely, driving to her sister's house in Vermont and staying there until November 2nd. Derek eventually stopped asking why. The house on Ash Street was sold in 2023. The new owners reported nothing unusual, but in the Derry police archives, stored in a climate-controlled evidence room, the pumpkin remains. It has not rotted. It has not collapsed. The orange skin, though slightly withered, has retained its shape and color. And the carved face, those elongated eyes, that screaming mouth remains clearly visible. The teeth are stored separately, catalogued and sealed, waiting for a case that will never close. And every Halloween, without fail, the officers who work the night shift in the evidence room report the same thing. At exactly 2:14 a.m., a faint orange glow emanates from the storage locker where the pumpkin is kept, flickering like candlelight, though no candle burns inside. The evidence mounts each account darker than the last. What follows was reconstructed from a Savannah Police Department incident report filed in the early hours of November 1st, 2018. supplemented by witness testimony from Eleanor Vance, a 72-year-old retired elementary school teacher who had lived alone in her Victorian row house on East Jones Street for 43 years. The call came in at 12:17 a.m. The responding officers noted in their report that Mrs. Vance was lucid but visibly shaken, and insisted that 3 figures dressed as children had been standing on her porch for 17 minutes, ringing her doorbell at 5-minute intervals, despite the late hour. What distinguished this call from a routine disturbance complaint was what the officers discovered upon arrival: physical evidence that defied rational explanation, and a witness account that would be Mrs. Vance's final documented statement before her death 4 months later. The niece who inherited the property has refused all interviews except one, in which she confirmed a single detail. Every Halloween since 2018, at precisely midnight, the doorbell rings 3 times. Eleanor Vance had turned off her porch light at 9:47 p.m. on October 31st, 2018. She documented the time in a small journal she kept by her bedside, a habit from her teaching years when she recorded daily observations for lesson planning. The last group of trick-or-treaters had come by around 8:30 p.m. 3 genuine children accompanied by their father, dressed as superheroes. She'd given them candy corn and miniature chocolate bars, complimented their costumes, and locked her front door after they left. By 10 p.m., the street had grown quiet. The historic district of Savannah settled into its characteristic stillness, the kind that feels heavier than ordinary silence, as if the old brick and wrought iron absorbed sound rather than reflected it. Eleanor had changed into her nightgown and made herself chamomile tea. She sat in her living room reading a mystery novel, the lamp beside her chair casting a warm pool of light that barely reached the edges of the room. The house around her creaked and settled in ways she'd learned to recognize over 4 decades: the expansion and contraction of old wood, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, the occasional groan of pipes behind plaster walls. She knew every sound. She knew what belonged. At 11:47 p.m., she marked her place in the novel and carried her empty teacup to the kitchen. Through the window above her sink, she could see the narrow garden behind her house, overgrown with azaleas and draped with Spanish moss. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. She washed her cup, dried it, placed it in the cabinet. She was walking toward the stairs when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the quiet house like something physical. Eleanor stopped at the base of the staircase, one hand on the banister. She looked at the grandfather clock in the hallway, 12 a.m. exactly. November 1st now. Technically, All Saints' Day. She stood motionless for several seconds, listening. The doorbell did not ring again. She approached the front door slowly, her slippers making soft friction sounds against the hardwood floor. The peephole was old brass, installed decades before she'd bought the house. She leaned forward and looked through it. 3 small figures stood on her porch, perfectly still. Children in Halloween costumes, a ghost draped in white sheet, a witch in a black dress and pointed hat, a skeleton in painted black fabric with white bones. All 3 held empty white pillowcases, the kind children use for collecting candy. All 3 faced the door directly, as if they'd positioned themselves for optimal visibility through the peephole. Eleanor did not open the door. Something about the scene struck her as fundamentally wrong, though she couldn't immediately articulate why. The hour was wrong. The stillness was wrong. She watched them through the small glass circle, her breathing shallow. They did not move. Not the slight shifting of weight from foot to foot. Not the fidgeting of bored children. Not even the rise and fall of breathing. They simply stood, 3 small figures in costume, holding empty bags, staring at her door. She stepped back from the peephole. Her heart was beating faster than it should. She was 72 years old and had taught elementary school for 37 years. She was not afraid of children. But these were not behaving like children. She walked to the living room window and carefully pulled back the curtain edge, just enough to see the porch from an angle. The 3 figures remained exactly as they'd been, facing the door. The street beyond was empty. No parents waiting on the sidewalk. No cars parked nearby. Just the three small costumed figures on her porch in the middle of the night. The doorbell rang again. 12:05 a.m. Eleanor let the curtain fall. She returned to the peephole. The three figures had not changed position, had not moved, but something was different. She stared through the small circle of glass, trying to identify what had shifted. Then she realized they were closer. Not much closer, perhaps 6 inches, perhaps a foot, but definitely closer to the door than they'd been 5 minutes earlier. She had not heard footsteps. She had not heard the porch boards creak. The children had simply moved forward while maintaining their exact positions relative to each other, as if they'd been pushed forward by some invisible hand. Her mouth had gone dry. She watched them through the peephole, and as she watched, she became aware of details she hadn't noticed before. The ghost's sheet hung too perfectly straight, without the natural drape of fabric over a human form. The witch's hat cast no shadow despite the porch light's glow. The skeleton's painted bones were too anatomically precise, too detailed for a children's costume. She picked up her telephone from the hall table. Her hand shook slightly as she dialed. Not 911, not yet. That felt too extreme. But her neighbor's number, Mrs. Chen, 2 doors down, whose grandson often played on the street. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Eleanor hung up without leaving a message. She checked the grandfather clock. 12:09 a.m. The doorbell rang a third time at 12:10 a.m. Eleanor returned to the peephole immediately. The 3 figures had moved closer again. They were now standing directly in front of her door, so close that she could see details she had been unable to see before. Her breath caught in her throat. The white sheet of the ghost costume had no eye holes cut into it, but she could see eyes beneath the fabric. Large eyes, too large for a child's face, with irises so pale they were almost colorless. The witch's face, visible beneath the brim of her hat, had skin that looked wrong, too smooth, too tight, stretched over bones that pressed against it from underneath. The smile was too wide, extending beyond where a normal mouth should end. The skeleton's face was not painted white. The white was its actual face. Bone-colored skin pulled taut over a skull that was slightly too narrow, slightly too long. They were not children. They had never been children, the ghost spoke. Eleanor could hear the voice clearly through the door, through the wood and the locks and the small brass peephole. It sounded like wind moving through broken glass, like the noise dead leaves make when they scrape across pavement, like the exhalation from something that had no lungs. "We've been waiting since you were young, Eleanor." The voice knew her name. "Don't you remember us? You promised you would let us in." Eleanor stepped back from the door. Her legs felt weak. The telephone was still in her hand. She did not remember making any promise. She had no memory of these things, these creatures dressed as children. But something deep in her mind, something below conscious thought, responded to the voice with recognition. An old recognition, a forgotten recognition, like remembering a nightmare from childhood that had been buried for 60 years. The doorbell did not ring again. Instead, there was a soft sound, tap, 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 3 small knuckles rapping against the wood. Then another tap, tap, tap from a different position on the door. Then a third set, closer to the doorknob. They were knocking now, all 3 of them, moving their hands across the door's surface in gentle percussion. The sound was patient. The sound was willing to wait. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she dialed 911. The operator answered on the second ring. 911. "What's your emergency?" "There are 3 people on my porch," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too high and thin. "They've been ringing my doorbell. They won't leave." "Are you in any immediate danger, ma'am?" "I don't know." "I don't. They're not children. They're dressed like children, but they're not." The operator's voice remained professional, calm. "Can you describe what you're seeing?" Eleanor looked through the peephole again. All 3 figures had their faces pressed against her door now, impossibly close, as if the wood were glass and they were peering through from the other side. The eyes, all 6 eyes, were fixed on the peephole. fixed on her. They knew exactly where she was standing. The witch's too wide smile had grown wider. "They're wearing costumes," Eleanor whispered into the phone. "Halloween costumes. But their faces are wrong. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Can you confirm your address?" Eleanor provided her address. The knocking had stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse. She could feel them on the other side of the door, waiting, patient. They had been waiting since she was young, the ghost had said. How long ago was that? When she was 5? 10? 60 years of waiting? What kind of thing waited 60 years? "Ma'am, I'm going to stay on the line with you until officers arrive. Don't open the door." "I won't," Eleanor said. But even as she said it, she felt something shifting inside her mind, some old buried memory trying to surface. A summer night. She was 7 years old. She was playing outside after dark, something her mother had forbidden. 3 other children had been with her, playing hide and seek in the neighborhood. But when it was her turn to hide, she'd seen them 3 figures watching from beneath a streetlight. A ghost, a witch, a skeleton. They'd smiled at her with 2 wide smiles and beckoned her to come closer, to come play with them, to come keep them company forever. She'd run home. She'd never told anyone, and she'd forgotten. The memory had been buried so deeply that it might as well have never existed. But they had not forgotten. "Eleanor," the wind-through glass voice whispered through the door. "We've been so patient. We've waited so long. Just open the door. Let us in. Complete the promise you made when you ran away." "I didn't promise anything," Eleanor said aloud. "Yes, you did." This voice was different, the witch's voice, a rustling, dry sound like autumn leaves. "When you saw us, when you ran, when you looked back over your shoulder, that was the promise. That was the invitation. We've come to collect it." The doorknob began to turn. Slowly. It rotated counterclockwise, metal grinding against metal, though no hand from outside could possibly reach it through the locked deadbolt. Eleanor watched it turn, watched the brass knob rotate in its socket, watched the internal mechanism begin to disengage. She dropped the phone and ran to the kitchen. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the drawer handle. She pulled it open and found a butcher knife, held it in front of her like a talisman. Through the house, she could hear the front door's deadbolt clicking. She had not unlocked it. The door was unlocking itself. She heard the door swing open. She heard the soft padding of small feet entering her house, moving across her hardwood floor. 3 sets of footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization, moving with purpose, moving toward the kitchen where she stood with her back against the counter and a knife gripped in both hands. They appeared in the kitchen doorway. The ghost, the witch, the skeleton. Up close, in the light of her kitchen, they were worse than she'd imagined. The proportions were all wrong. The limbs too long, the joints bending in directions that human joints should not bend. The skin where there was skin had a texture like paper that had been wetted and dried repeatedly, puckered and translucent. "We don't want to hurt you, Eleanor," the skeleton said. Its voice was a creaking sound, like old hinges. "We just want to come in. You should have let us in 65 years ago. We've been waiting outside ever since. Waiting and growing hungry. Get out of my house." Eleanor's voice cracked. The knife shook in her grip. "You invited us," the witch said. "The door is open now. We're inside. This is where we've always belonged. In your house, in your life. You've lived 65 years that should have belonged to us." They moved forward in unison. Eleanor screamed and swung the knife, but her arm moved through empty air. The 3 figures flickered like bad television static, their forms dissolving and reconstituting inches closer each time. The ghost reached out with hands that ended in too many fingers, fingers that stretched longer than fingers should stretch, reaching for Eleanor's face. Outside, a siren wailed. Police cars pulling onto East Jones Street. The 3 figures paused, their heads turning in perfect synchronization toward the sound. Eleanor felt a rushing sensation, like air being sucked out of the room. The ghost looked back at her with its 2 large eyes. "We'll be back, Eleanor. Every Halloween, every midnight, until you let us stay. They dissolved, not vanishing, but unraveling, their forms coming apart like smoke dispersing in wind, leaving nothing behind except the smell of old earth and something sweet and rotten. Eleanor collapsed against the counter, the knife clattering to the floor. Her chest felt tight. Her left arm tingled. She couldn't catch her breath. The police found her on the kitchen floor 7 minutes later, conscious but barely able to speak. The front door stood wide open. The officer's report noted 3 sets of small footprints on the porch burned into the wooden boards, the wood charred black in the precise shape of children's shoes. The prints led to the front door. They did not lead away. Eleanor was transported to the hospital with symptoms of acute cardiac distress. She was released 3 days later and returned home with medication for anxiety and heart palpitations. She lived 4 more months. The stroke came in her sleep on a Tuesday in March, sudden and massive. She died before the ambulance arrived. Her niece, Amanda, inherited the house. Amanda had always loved the Victorian architecture, the historic neighborhood, the Spanish moss. She moved in during June, began renovations in July. She replaced the porch boards where the footprints had been burned, sanded, and repainted the front door. She tried to make the house hers. On October 31st of that year, Amanda turned off her porch light at 10 p.m. and locked her doors. She sat in the living room watching a movie, a bowl of leftover candy beside her. At exactly midnight, the doorbell rang. Then again at 12:05 a.m. Then again at 12:10 a.m. Amanda looked through the peephole. 3 small figures stood on her porch in Halloween costumes: a ghost, a witch, and a skeleton. All 3 stared at the door with eyes that were too large and smiles that were too wide. Amanda has not answered the door. She moved out the following day and refuses to spend Halloween night in the house. She rents it to tenants during the rest of the year, but insists the lease include a clause allowing them to break occupancy during the final week of October. Most tenants leave for Halloween. Those who stay report the same phenomenon. 3 rings of the doorbell at midnight. Some have looked through the peephole. None have opened the door. The footprints return every November 1st, burned fresh into whatever wood covers the porch, leading to the door but never away. The house remains on East Jones Street in Savannah's historic district. The doorbell still rings 3 times every Halloween at midnight. And somewhere, 3 figures dressed as children stand patiently on the porch, holding empty bags, waiting for someone to remember the promise and finally let them inside. The evidence mounts. Some records are too precise to dismiss, too calculated to be coincidence. The incident report submitted by Marcus Blaine on November 1st, 2016, remains one of the most disturbing documents in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery's restricted personnel files. For 11 years, Blaine had maintained an unblemished record as night security, navigating the cemetery's 47 acres with procedural efficiency. He was known for his thoroughness, his calm under pressure, his ability to distinguish between actual disturbances and the nervous imaginings that plague graveyard workers after dark. On Halloween night 2016, something occurred that shattered that composure entirely. The report he filed, detailed, precise, and deeply unsettling, was immediately classified by cemetery administration. What follows has been reconstructed from that suppressed document, supplemented by personnel interviews, medical records, and a discovery in the cemetery's historical archives that defies rational explanation. The evening of October 31st, 2016, began like any other shift for Marcus Blaine. He arrived at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery at 8:45 p.m., 15 minutes before his scheduled start, as was his habit. The main office sat dark and empty. The administrative staff had left hours earlier, eager to return home before the Halloween festivities reached their peak. Marcus didn't mind. He preferred the solitude of night work, the quiet dignity of watching over the dead while the living celebrated. He performed his standard equipment check with methodical precision. Flashlight fully charged, radio functioning on all channels, motion sensor control panel displaying normal readings across all 12 zones. The cemetery's security system had been upgraded 2 years prior, fitted with infrared sensors throughout the property, particularly concentrated in the older sections where vandalism had once been a problem. Since the installation, incidents had dropped to nearly zero. Marcus signed into the logbook, noting the temperature 41 degrees, unseasonably cold for central Pennsylvania in late October. A dense fog had settled over the grounds earlier that evening, thick enough that the decorative lampposts cast only dim halos of light that barely penetrated 10 feet. He could hear muffled sounds from the neighborhood beyond the cemetery's iron fence, children laughing, car doors slamming, the distant bass thump of a party somewhere down the hill. He poured coffee from his thermos and settled into the first patrol round at 9:15 p.m. The walking path wound through the newer sections first, where the headstones stood straight and the grass remained neatly trimmed. His boots crunched over gravel. The fog swallowed the beam of his flashlight after only a few yards, creating a moving bubble of visibility that made the cemetery feel smaller, more confined. Marcus had walked these paths thousands of times. He knew every turn, every rise in the landscape, every tree that leaned over the walking trail. Everything felt normal. Routine. Safe. At 9:47 p.m., the radio on his belt crackled to life, not with a voice, but with the automated alert tone from the motion sensor system. Zone 7, the oldest section of the cemetery, dating back to 1793, when Evergreen had been nothing more than a small colonial burial ground. Marcus paused mid-step, listening. The tone repeated twice, then fell silent. He keyed his radio. "Control! This is Blaine!" Confirming Zone 7 activation. Static answered him. Long, hissing static that shouldn't have been there. The radio system was digital, clear on all frequencies. Marcus tried again. "Control, do you copy?" More static, punctuated by what might have been a voice, distant, distorted, speaking words he couldn't parse. Then, silence. The radio's LED display flickered once and returned to normal. Marcus altered his route, heading north toward Zone 7. The fog seemed thicker here, pressing against him like something with weight and intention. His flashlight beam struggled to penetrate it, creating a wall of white just beyond arm's reach. The temperature had dropped. He could see his breath now, each exhalation hanging in the air longer than it should. He reached the 1793 section within 7 minutes. The headstones here were ancient, many tilted at angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by 2 centuries of weather. Some dated from before American independence, marking the graves of farmers and merchants and children who died of diseases that no longer existed. Marcus swept his flashlight across the area methodically, checking between headstones, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. No indication anyone had been here. No disturbance. No trespasser. But the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive in a way that made his chest tighten. Marcus stood still, listening. The sounds from the neighborhood beyond the fence had vanished entirely. Even the wind had died. The silence pressed against his eardrums like water at depth. He logged the incident in his notebook. 9:47 p.m., Zone 7, false alarm, and turned to continue his patrol. At 10:22 p.m., the radio alert sounded again. Zone 7, same location. Marcus stopped walking. He was in the central area of the cemetery now, surrounded by headstones from the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds. The second alert felt different, more insistent somehow, though that was impossible. An automated system didn't have intent. He keyed the radio again. Control. Second. Activation. Zone 7. Investigating. The static that answered him was worse this time. Underneath the hiss, he could hear something that sounded almost like breathing. Deep, rhythmic, not quite human. Marcus began walking toward Zone 7 again, faster now. His hand tightened around the flashlight. In 11 years, he'd dealt with teenagers trying to conduct seances, urban explorers looking for supposedly haunted graves, even a confused elderly man who'd wandered in thinking it was a public park. But 2 motion alerts in the same zone within 35 minutes suggested someone was deliberately lingering in the oldest section. The fog had grown denser. Visibility had shrunk to barely 5 feet. Marcus could feel moisture condensing on his face, cold and slick. His boots sounded too loud against the gravel, each step echoing in the unnatural silence. As he approached Zone 7, the temperature dropped again. The cold bit through his jacket, settling into his bones. His breath came out in thick plumes that didn't dissipate. They hung in the fog like frozen ghosts. He swept his flashlight across the headstones, moving slowly, checking each shadow. Most of the stones in this section stood no higher than his waist, weathered and dark with age. Some bore death's heads carved into their tops, grinning skulls with wings, a colonial reminder of mortality. Then his flashlight caught something that made him freeze. A woman stood beside one of the headstones. She faced away from him, motionless, her posture unnaturally straight. She wore a white gown that hung to the ground, the fabric clinging to her body as if soaked through. Her hair fell long and black over her shoulders, wet and streaming, water dripping steadily to the ground, though no rain had fallen. Marcus's training kicked in automatically. "This is private property," he called out, his voice steady despite the sudden hammering of his heart. "The cemetery is closed. You need to leave." The woman didn't move, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. Marcus took 3 steps closer, keeping his flashlight trained on her. "Ma'am, I need you to respond. Can you hear me?" Still, nothing. She stood beside a headstone, so old its inscription had been worn completely smooth, just a rectangular slab of weathered granite tilted at a 40-degree angle. Water pooled at her feet, spreading outward in a dark circle that seemed too large for the amount dripping from her hair and clothes. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to turn around." She turned. The movement was instant, no gradual rotation, no shift of weight. One moment, she faced away. The next, she faced him directly. Her gown hung in tatters, burial fabric that looked centuries old. Her arms hung at her sides, fingers elongated and too pale, the nails blackened. But it was her face that stopped Marcus's breath in his throat. Where features should have been eyes, nose, mouth, there was only a hollow cavity. Not shadow, not darkness. An actual void, as if something had reached inside her skull and scooped away every trace of identity. The edges of the cavity were smooth, surgical almost, creating a perfect oval of nothingness in the center of her head. Marcus took an involuntary step backward. His flashlight beam struck that hollow space and seemed to stop there, absorbed rather than reflected. The woman raised her right arm slowly, deliberately. Her hand was skeletal beneath the wet, translucent skin. She pointed directly at Marcus, her finger held steady, unwavering, the gesture carrying a weight of accusation that made his blood turn cold. Then, still pointing at him with one hand, she raised her left arm and pointed at something behind her, at the headstone she'd been standing beside. Marcus's flashlight followed her gesture. The beam fell on the weathered granite, illuminating the smooth surface he'd seen earlier. But now there was writing. The inscription hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. Marcus was certain. The stone had been blank, worn smooth by centuries. But now letters stood carved deep into the granite, crisp and clear as if freshly cut. Marcus Blaine, born July 14, 1971, died October 31, 2016. His birth date, his name, and tonight's date as his death. Marcus's legs went weak. The flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam shaking across the impossible inscription. His mind tried to reject what he was seeing, tried to find rational explanations. A prank, a projection, some kind of Halloween joke staged by teenagers with too much time and technology. But the woman with the hollowed face still stood there, both arms extended, pointing at him, at the grave, at his death. She took a step toward him. Her bare feet made no sound on the wet grass. Water continued streaming from her hair, from the rotting burial gown, pooling wherever she stepped. Her arms remained extended in that double accusation. "This is you. This is your grave. This is where you belong." Marcus tried to speak and found his throat had closed. His radio erupted in static so loud it was painful. a shrieking electronic scream that made him tear it from his belt and drop it to the ground. The motion sensor system's alert tone began sounding continuously now, not just from Zone 7 but from zones all around him. 8, 6, 9, as if invisible presences were triggering every sensor in the cemetery simultaneously. The woman took another step. Close enough now that Marcus could see the water dripping from her wasn't water at all. It was too dark, too thick. It left rust-colored stains on the grass where it fell. She opened her mouth. The hollow cavity that replaced her face somehow opened wider, impossibly wide, creating a void large enough to swallow him whole. From inside that darkness came a sound. Not words, not a voice. A pulling sensation, like vacuum, like the cemetery itself was inhaling. Marcus turned and ran. His boots slipped on wet grass as he sprinted between headstones, his flashlight beam jerking wildly through the fog. Behind him, he heard footsteps, soft, wet, steady footsteps that shouldn't exist because that thing wasn't human, and its feet had made no sound before, but now they followed him with relentless precision. He risked a glance backward and wished he hadn't. She was closer, impossibly closer. Her gown trailed behind her like a funeral shroud, and the hollow cavity of her face seemed to have grown larger, consuming more of her head, spreading like a void that wanted to swallow reality itself. Other shapes moved in the fog, now figures between headstones, emerging from the ground itself. Men in rotting suits, children in burial clothes, a woman crawling on hands and knees, her spine bent at an angle that spoke of violence. All of them faceless, all of them hollow, all of them moving toward him. Marcus's lungs burned. His heart hammered against his ribs with a force that felt like it might crack bone. He could see his vehicle ahead, the white security truck parked near the main gate. 50 yards, 40. The woman's wet footsteps were directly behind him now. He could hear her breathing, a sound like water draining through stone. 20 yards. Something grabbed his ankle. Marcus went down hard, his flashlight flying from his hand, spinning away into the fog. A hand had emerged from the ground itself, skeletal fingers wrapped around his boot, squeezing with impossible strength. He kicked frantically, his other boot connecting with the hand, once, twice, until the fingers released. He scrambled to his feet and ran the final distance to the truck. Marcus's hands shook so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. Through the windshield, he could see the woman standing at the cemetery's edge, just beyond the fence line. Motionless now, watching with that hollow absence where her face should be. The engine turned over. Marcus threw the transmission into drive and accelerated hard, gravel spraying from his tires as he fled down the access road. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he reached the nearest gas station 3 miles away, where he sat in the parking lot under fluorescent lights while his entire body shook. He called his supervisor, tried to explain, heard the skepticism in the man's voice, exhaustion, Halloween stress, an overactive imagination. Marcus never returned to Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. The next morning, driven by a need he couldn't explain, he contacted the cemetery's historical society and requested records for the 1793 section. The society's archivist pulled files dating back to the cemetery's founding. On the 4th page of a handwritten burial registry from 1952, there was an entry, headstone removed from colonial section. Name, Marcus Blaine. Dates, 1971 to 2016. Stone determined to be hoax or error. No corresponding burial. Stone destroyed per cemetery board decision. A headstone bearing his exact name, his exact birth year, predicting his death on October 31st, 2016, had existed in that cemetery for decades before he was born. It had been removed, supposedly destroyed, but on Halloween night 2016, it had returned. Marcus Blaine submitted his formal resignation on November 2nd, 2016. His medical records indicate a new cardiac condition began the night of October 31st, a persistent arrhythmia that specialists cannot explain, as if something reached into his chest and altered the rhythm of his heart. He has not celebrated Halloween since that night. He does not visit cemeteries. And, according to those who know him, He becomes violently ill whenever he sees his own name written down, as if the inscription on that impossible headstone has been carved into his body itself, counting down to a death that was predicted before he was born. The headstone, according to current cemetery records, does not exist. But Marcus Blaine's heart continues its irregular beat, marking time toward October 31st of some unknown year. The hollow-faced woman pointed at a grave. Some gestures cannot be taken back. The archives yield one final testimony, a case that defies burial, no matter how deep we dig. In October of 2009, the quiet residents of Maple Street in rural Vermont began documenting an annual phenomenon that would persist without explanation for 7 consecutive years. What follows has been reconstructed from witness statements, police reports filed between 2009 and 2016, and digital correspondence recovered from the Vermont State Police Cold Case Division. The testimony of multiple residents, corroborated across independent accounts, describes an individual who appeared only on Halloween night, conducting commerce that left permanent psychological scarring on those who engaged with him. The seller's identity was never confirmed. His merchandise was never recovered by authorities. And the children who accepted his wares paid prices that extended far beyond the transaction itself. Maple Street was a cul-de-sac of 12 homes, built in the late 1980 seconds on land that had once been agricultural. The street terminated at a small traffic circle, surrounded by mature maple trees that turned violent shades of orange and red each October. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes without supervision, and Halloween was celebrated with elaborate decorations and full-size candy bars. The first documented appearance of the mask seller occurred on October 31st, 2009, at approximately 6:47 p.m., according to a statement given by resident Patricia Holloway to the Rutland County Sheriff's Department. Holloway had been distributing candy when she noticed an old man standing beside a wooden cart at the end of the cul-de-sac, positioned directly beneath the traffic circle's single streetlight. She described him as elderly, perhaps 70 or older, wearing a long black coat that reached his ankles despite the evening being unseasonably warm. His cart was simple, 4 wheels, wooden slats, a faded green canvas stretched across metal supports to form a makeshift roof. Hanging from hooks along the cart's perimeter were masks, dozens of them. They swayed slightly in the absent breeze, their empty eye sockets reflecting the streetlight's cold illumination. Holloway stated that she had never seen the man before. She watched as children approached the cart during their trick-or-treating route. The old man never spoke. When a child drew near, he would gesture toward the masks with one gloved hand, a slow, sweeping motion that invited selection. The masks themselves were handmade. She noted not the cheap plastic varieties sold in stores, but constructed from some kind of flexible material that caught the light strangely. Each mask depicted a specific human face rendered in disturbing detail. High cheekbones, crow's feet, individual pores. Some appeared elderly, others were young, a few looked like children. None of the masks were designed to be frightening in the traditional sense. They were simply faces, neutral expressions, eyes closed or half-lidded. The uncanny precision of their construction made them deeply unsettling, in a way Holloway struggled to articulate in her statement. She noted that several children selected masks that night, thanked the old man silently. He never acknowledged them and continued their evening. The man remained at his cart until approximately 9:30 p.m., at which point he simply wheeled it away down Maple Street, disappearing at the intersection with Route 7. No vehicle was observed. The phenomenon repeated in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014. Each Halloween, without exception, the old man appeared at the end of Maple Street between 6:30 and 7 p.m. He never varied his position. He never spoke. His cart always contained masks, though the specific inventory seemed to change annually. Some residents began to anticipate his arrival. Others found it disturbing enough that they drove their children to trick or treat in neighboring subdivisions. A police report filed in October 2012 by resident Mark Dennison requested a wellness check on the elderly individual citing concerns about his apparent homelessness and the fact that no one had ever seen him outside of Halloween night. Officers responded at 7:15 p.m. on October 31st, 2012. According to the incident report, they approached the cart and attempted to engage the man in conversation. He did not respond to verbal questions. He did not present identification when requested. When Officer Sandra Miles attempted to examine the contents of his cart more closely, he stepped between her and the merchandise, blocking access with his body. The officers noted that his face was deeply lined, almost cadaverous in appearance, and that his eyes, pale gray, nearly colorless, did not blink during the entire interaction. He smelled, they reported, like old paper and something faintly chemical, reminiscent of formaldehyde. The officers had no legal grounds to detain him. He was not blocking traffic. He was not disturbing the peace. He was engaged in what appeared to be legitimate commerce, albeit strange. They issued a verbal warning that he would need a vendor's permit if he intended to continue operating on public property, then departed. The man remained at his cart until approximately 9 p.m., as usual, before wheeling it away into darkness. No follow-up was conducted. No permit was ever filed. The incident that severed normalcy occurred on October 31st, 2015. Ethan Cross was 11 years old, a sixth grader at Rutland Intermediate School, who lived with his mother, Janet Cross, at 47 Maple Street. Eleanor Cross had died in January of that year following complications from pneumonia. Ethan had been close with her. Her death marked his first significant experience with mortality. According to Janet Cross's statement, Ethan had been reluctant to celebrate Halloween that year, but eventually agreed to trick-or-treat with friends from his class. At approximately 7:20 p.m., Ethan and two friends approached the mask seller's cart. The old man was in his customary position beneath the streetlight, surrounded by his collection. Ethan's friends selected masks quickly, one depicting a bearded man with kind eyes, another showing a young woman with braided hair. Both thanked the seller and moved on. Ethan lingered. He studied the masks carefully, moving along the cart's perimeter, examining each one. He paused before a mask hanging near the cart's rear corner. The mask depicted an elderly woman, thin face, high cheekbones, silver hair pulled back into a loose bun, deep-set eyes, a small mole on the left cheek. Ethan recognized every detail. It was his grandmother's face, rendered with impossible precision down to the pattern of wrinkles around her mouth and the exact shape of her ears. The mask even captured the slight asymmetry of her smile, the way the left corner lifted fractionally higher than the right. Ethan dropped the mask. It struck the pavement with a soft slap, the rubber face staring upward at nothing. He backed away from the cart, stammering something incoherent to the old man, then turned and ran. His friends called after him. He did not respond. He ran the 4 blocks home, burst through the front door, and locked himself in his bedroom. When his mother questioned him, he could only repeat that the man had a mask of Grandma Eleanor, that he had seen her face hanging from a hook, that the mask seller knew what she looked like. Janet Cross returned to the end of Maple Street at 7:45 p.m. The cart was gone. The old man was gone. The streetlight illuminated empty pavement. She filed a police report the following morning, November 1st, describing her son's distress and requesting investigation into how the mask seller had obtained a likeness of her deceased mother. The report was assigned to Detective Raymond Keller. No evidence was recovered. No witnesses could provide additional information. The case remained open, but inactive. The visitation began that same night. Ethan woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of tapping on his bedroom window. His room was on the 2nd floor, facing the backyard. There was no tree close enough to brush the glass. No wind that night. The tapping continued, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan remained motionless in his bed, staring at the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could see shadow movement behind them. A dark shape blocking the streetlight's distant glow. The tapping stopped. Then came the voice, his grandmother's voice, thin and distant, muffled by the glass but unmistakable in its cadence and tone. She spoke his name, just his name, over and over. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. The same inflection she had used when calling him to dinner. The same warmth and familiarity, but there was something wrong beneath it. Something hollow, like an echo of an echo. Ethan pulled his blanket over his head. He pressed his hands over his ears. He could still hear her. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. The voice continued without pause, without variation, without breath. It persisted until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the curtains. Then it stopped. Silence returned. When Ethan finally summoned the courage to look, the window was empty. But on the glass, pressed against the exterior surface, were two handprints. Small, delicate, elderly hands. The condensation from the prints remained visible until the morning sun evaporated them. He told his mother. She contacted the police. Officers found no evidence of anyone having climbed to the second floor. The ground below was undisturbed. No ladder marks. No footprints. Detective Keller interviewed Ethan on November 3rd. The boy's account was consistent, detailed, unwavering. Keller noted in his report that Ethan exhibited genuine fear, elevated heart rate, difficulty maintaining eye contact, trembling hands. This was not fabrication. This was trauma. The visitations continued nightly through November. Always at 3:17 a.m. Always the tapping. Always the voice. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. His mother moved him to the guest room on the first floor. The tapping followed. She installed blackout curtains. The voice persisted. She played white noise machines. They barely muffled the sound. Ethan stopped sleeping. His grades declined. He developed dark circles under his eyes and began to lose weight. Janet Cross took him to 3 different therapists. None could explain the phenomenon. Sleep medications provided no relief. Ethan would wake at precisely 3:17 a.m. regardless of dosage. On November 28th, Janet Cross received a phone call from Helen Martinez, another Maple Street resident. Martinez's daughter, Sophie, age 9, had also selected a mask from the cart on Halloween night. The mask had depicted a middle-aged man with a distinctive scar across his left eyebrow. Sophie's father, Michael Martinez, had died in a car accident in 2013. The scar matched perfectly. Sophie was now experiencing nightly visitations, her father's voice outside her window, calling her name repeatedly from 3:17 a.m. until dawn. 2 more families came forward within days. Thomas Brennan, age 12, had selected a mask depicting a small child with a cleft lip. His mother, Anna Brennan, revealed in her statement that she had given birth to a stillborn daughter in 1998, 3 years before Thomas was born. The infant had presented with a cleft lip. Thomas had never been told about his sister. No photographs existed. Anna had specifically requested all medical records be sealed. Yet the mask depicted the child's face with absolute accuracy. Thomas was now hearing infant crying outside his window each night. Beginning at 3:17 a.m., Detective Keller expanded his investigation. He attempted to locate the mask seller through vendor registries, business licenses, and property records. No matches were found. He reviewed traffic camera footage from Route 7 on October 31st, 2015. The cart appeared on camera at 9:14 p.m., wheeled by the elderly man in his black coat. He moved south. The next camera, positioned half a mile down the road, showed no sign of him. He had vanished in the intervening distance. The visitations ceased abruptly on December 1st. All 4 children reported that the nightly disturbances stopped without explanation. The voices, the tapping, the presence at the windows all gone. But the psychological damage remained. Ethan Cross required ongoing therapy for night terrors. Sophie Martinez developed severe anxiety around windows and refused to sleep in any room with exterior exposure. The families began to leave Maple Street. By March 2016, 6 of the 12 homes on the cul-de-sac had been sold. The mask seller did not return in 2016. October 31st passed without incident. The end of Maple Street remained empty, the streetlight illuminating nothing but fallen leaves. The phenomenon appeared to have concluded until October 2024, Rebecca Holloway, daughter of Patricia Holloway, who had first reported the mask seller in 2009, was cleaning out her late mother's attic at 52 Maple Street. Patricia had died in August, following a stroke. Among the boxes of holiday decorations and old photographs, Rebecca found a wooden crate marked with the date, October 2015. Inside were 23 masks. Each one depicted a specific human face. Rebecca recognized them: Walter Chen, who had died in 2017; Margaret Stiles, 2019; David Kornfeld, 2020. All former Maple Street residents, all deceased. The masks captured their faces with impossible precision, down to individual liver spots and the exact pattern of their final wrinkles. At the bottom of the crate was one final mask. Rebecca lifted it slowly. The face was her own. Every detail, the small scar on her left temple from a childhood fall, the asymmetry of her eyebrows, the precise shape of her lips. The eyes were closed. The expression was peaceful, serene, as if she were sleeping or dead. Rebecca Holloway relocated to Portland, Maine, within 72 hours. She refused all interview requests from local media and law enforcement. She provided no forwarding address to former neighbors. Detective Keller, now retired, attempted to contact her in November 2024. She did not respond. But according to a statement given by her former neighbor, Elizabeth Warren, Rebecca received something in the mail on October 31st, 2024. A single photograph, postmarked from Portland, Maine. No return address. The image showed the mask seller's cart, positioned on a quiet residential street. The street light above illuminated the wooden structure clearly. The masks hung from their hooks, swaying slightly. And in the background, partially visible through the frame's edge, was the front door of a house. Rebecca's new house. The number 237 clearly visible on the mailbox. Rebecca Holloway has not been seen since November 4th, 2024. Her landlord filed a missing person report on November 10th after she failed to pay rent. Portland police conducted a wellness check. The apartment was empty. No signs of struggle. No forwarding information. Her car remained in the parking lot. Her personal belongings were undisturbed. But on the kitchen table, investigators found a single item, a handmade mask depicting Rebecca Holloway's face. Eyes closed, expression peaceful. The case remains open. 1:07 a.m. The evidence runs cold. But the final file remains open, and its contents demand witness. The report that follows was assembled from police records, hospital intake forms, and witness testimony provided by the Hernandez family of suburban Dallas, Texas. Between November 1st and November 3rd, 2022, a series of incidents occurred that led to the family's permanent relocation and the disappearance of physical evidence from official custody. What began as a concern over tainted Halloween candy evolved into something far more disturbing, an encounter with an entity that understood the rituals of the holiday in ways that suggested patience, intention, and an intelligence that operated outside natural law. The mother's statement, recorded 3 days after the initial incident, described her daughter's behavior as like she'd been marked. The father's testimony referenced something that knew where we lived. This reconstruction is based on their accounts, supplemented by dispatch recordings and the observations of responding officers. The tooth was photographed before it vanished. The security footage was reviewed before the hard drive corrupted. What remains is testimony and the understanding that some transactions, once made, cannot be undone. The Hernandez house sat at the end of Maple Ridge Court, a quiet cul-de-sac lined with Bradford pears and motion sensor porch lights that blinked on in sequence as twilight deepened. It was November 1st, 2022, just past 7:30 in the evening, and the neighborhood still smelled faintly of smoke from backyard fire pits and the lingering sweetness of candy wrappers crushed into driveways. Inside the house, Maria Hernandez stood at the kitchen counter sorting through leftover Halloween decorations, while her husband, David, loaded the dishwasher. Their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, had returned from trick-or-treating 20 minutes earlier, accompanied by her older brother and 2 neighborhood kids. The group had come through the front door laughing, their pillowcases bulging with candy, their faces flushed from the October chill that had finally settled over North Texas after weeks of unseasonable warmth. But Lily had not dumped her candy onto the floor like the others. She had not raced her brother to claim the best pieces or negotiated trades for chocolate bars. Instead, she had walked directly to the kitchen table, set her orange plastic pumpkin bucket down with both hands, and sat in the chair facing the window. She had not moved since. Maria noticed first. She glanced over her shoulder while rinsing a bowl and saw her daughter sitting perfectly still, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the bucket. The posture was wrong, too rigid, too deliberate. Children did not sit like that after trick-or-treating. They bounced, they shouted, they spilled candy across every surface and argued over fairness, and made themselves sick on chocolate before bedtime. Maria dried her hands on a dish towel and crossed the kitchen. "Lil, you okay, baby?" Lily did not look up. Her gaze remained locked on the bucket. "I can't open it," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, absent of the excitement that had colored her speech all week leading up to Halloween. Maria frowned and crouched beside the chair. "What do you mean, sweetie? Of course you can open it. It's your candy." Lily shook her head slowly, the motion mechanical. The tall man put something inside. He said, "I have to keep it." The kitchen went quiet. David turned from the dishwasher, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something sharper. Maria felt her pulse quicken, the instinctive alarm that every parent knows when a child's words suggest danger. "What tall man?" she asked, keeping her voice calm. "Where did you see him? Where did you see him? Where did you see him?" Lily's hands tightened in her lap. "At the house with the orange lights, the one at the end of Birchwood. He was standing by the fence. He gave me something and said I have to keep it. He said he'd know if I opened it." Maria straightened and exchanged a glance with David. Birchwood Drive was 2 streets over, a stretch of larger homes with deep front yards and tall privacy fences. They had agreed Lily could trick or treat there with her brother's group, but only on well-lit streets. The idea of an adult stranger singling out their daughter, giving her something and making her promise to keep it, every worst-case scenario flooded Maria's mind at once. David moved quickly. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the neighborhood app, scrolling through posts, looking for warnings or alerts about suspicious activity. Maria reached for the pumpkin bucket, but Lily's hand shot out and gripped her wrist. The child's fingers were cold. Lily whispered, "He said I have to keep it." Maria pulled her hand back gently, her chest tightening. "Lily, I need you to tell me exactly what this man looked like. Was he wearing a costume? Did he say anything else?" Lily's eyes finally lifted, meeting her mother's gaze. There was something distant in them, something unfocused and hollow. He was really tall, taller than Daddy, and his arms were long. He didn't have a costume. He just stood there, and he smiled. David was already dialing. He pressed the phone to his ear and turned toward the living room, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to the dispatcher. Maria stayed crouched beside her daughter, one hand resting on the back of the chair, trying to project calm while her mind raced through possibilities. Predator, abduction attempt, something slipped into the candy, something touched, something said. The bucket sat on the table between them, its plastic surface decorated with grinning jack-o'-lanterns. It looked ordinary, it looked harmless, but Lily would not touch it. 2 patrol officers arrived within 15 minutes. They stood in the kitchen with their notebooks out, while David recounted the timeline, and Maria repeated Lily's description of the man. The officers asked standard questions: approximate height, clothing, vehicle, exact location. Lily answered in monosyllables, her affect flat, her gaze drifting back to the bucket whenever the officers looked away. One of the officers, a middle-aged man named Torres, asked if he could inspect the candy. David nodded and gestured toward the table. Torres pulled on a pair of latex gloves and carefully lifted the bucket, tilting it under the overhead light. He sorted through the contents methodically: miniature chocolate bars, lollipops, gummy packets, all standard Halloween fare. Nothing appeared tampered with. No punctures, no discoloration, no unusual weight. But at the bottom of the bucket, wedged beneath a Snickers bar, was something wrapped in black cloth. Torres paused. He lifted it carefully, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. The cloth was rough, like burlap, tied with a thin piece of twine. It was small, roughly the size of a walnut, but heavier than it should have been. The weight distribution was wrong. Torres set it on the table and glanced at his partner, a younger woman named Ruiz. She stepped closer, her expression uncertain. "You want me to open it?" Torres asked, directing the question to David. David nodded, his jaw tight. Maria moved behind Lily's chair and placed both hands on her daughter's shoulders. Lily's body went rigid. Torres untied the twine slowly, his movements deliberate. The cloth unfolded in layers, revealing something pale and smooth at the center. When the final fold fell away, the object rolled slightly on the table, catching the light. It was a tooth, a human molar, adult-sized, with a thick root still attached. The root was dark, crusted with something dried and brown that could only be blood. The enamel was yellowed, but intact. It looked like it had been pulled recently, forcibly, the root showing signs of tearing rather than clean extraction. The kitchen filled with a silence so complete that Maria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Ruiz took a step back, her hand moving instinctively toward her radio. Torres stared at the tooth, his gloved hand hovering above it, as if proximity alone might contaminate him. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Lily began to cry. Not the loud, gasping sobs of a frightened child, but a low, keening whimper that made Maria's skin crawl. "He wants it back," Lily whispered, her voice breaking. "He'll come get it." "He said he will." David moved quickly, lifting Lily from the chair and carrying her toward the living room, murmuring reassurances that sounded hollow even to him. Maria stayed in the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the tooth. Torres was already on his radio, calling for a supervisor, requesting evidence collection. Ruiz stepped outside to canvass the neighborhood, moving door to door with a description of the suspect that felt increasingly inadequate. Tall, unusually tall, long arms, no costume. Residents shook their heads. No one had seen anyone matching that description. The house at the end of Birchwood with the orange lights belonged to an elderly couple who had run out of candy by 7 and turned off their porch light. They had not seen a tall man. They had not seen anything unusual. Torres bagged the tooth as evidence, sealing it in a clear plastic envelope and logging it with a case number. He assured Maria and David that they would investigate fully, that they would check surveillance cameras in the area, that they would follow every lead. But his expression suggested doubt, the kind of uncertainty that came from encountering something that did not fit within established categories of crime. By 9:30, the officers had left. The house felt too quiet. David checked every lock twice, tested every window, activated the security system with its motion-sensing cameras aimed at the driveway and backyard. Maria sat with Lily on the couch, holding her daughter close, feeling the child's heartbeat gradually slow as exhaustion overtook fear. Lily fell asleep just after 10. Her small body curled against her mother's side, her breathing shallow and uneven. David carried her upstairs to her bedroom and tucked her beneath the covers, leaving the hallway light on and the door cracked open. He returned to the living room and sat beside Maria, both of them staring at the darkened television screen, neither speaking. The house settled around them, the normal creaks and shifts of a suburban home magnified by adrenaline and unease. At 11, they went to bed. David set his phone on the nightstand, with the ringer turned up, the security app open, the live camera feeds showing 4 empty rectangles of lawn and driveway bathed in pale motion sensor light. He closed his eyes but did not sleep. Maria lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her own breathing. At 3:33 a.m., the backyard lights triggered. David's phone buzzed on the nightstand, the security app chiming with a motion alert. He sat up instantly, his heart slamming against his ribs, and grabbed the phone. The camera feed showed the backyard in grainy black and white infrared, the grass pale, the fence a dark line at the edge of the frame. and standing beside the fence, motionless, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, shoulders too narrow. The torso stretched and gaunt. Its arms hung at its sides, but the hands reached past where the knees should be, the fingers elongated and ending in sharp points that caught the light like bone. The face, if it could be called a face, was smooth and featureless. No eyes, no nose, no discernible structure, except for the mouth. The mouth was open, and it was filled with too many teeth, rows of them, overlapping and jagged, extending back into a throat that seemed to have no end. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Then it raised one hand, slowly, deliberately, and extended a single finger toward the house, toward the second floor, toward Lily's window. David could not breathe. He stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing, his body frozen in a state of pure animal terror. Beside him, Maria stirred, waking, her voice groggy. "David? What?" She stopped when she saw his face. She followed his gaze to the phone, and then she saw it too. The scream that tore from her throat was involuntary, primal, the sound of a mother recognizing a threat to her child. David dropped the phone and bolted from the bed, running into the hallway, throwing open Lily's door. The girl was sitting up in bed, her eyes open, staring at the window. The curtains were drawn, but the glow of the motion lights bled through the fabric. "He's here," Lily whispered. "He wants it back." David crossed the room in 2 strides and scooped Lily into his arms, carrying her out of the bedroom. Maria was already in the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear, calling 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what was happening. David carried Lily downstairs, away from the windows, into the center of the living room, where no external walls offered line of sight. He set her on the couch and knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders. "Stay here. Don't move." He ran back upstairs, grabbed his phone, and pulled up the camera feed again. The backyard was empty. The figure was gone. No movement, no shadow, nothing. The motion lights were still on, illuminating an empty yard, the grass undisturbed, the fence intact. David stood in the hallway, his chest heaving, staring at the screen. 30 seconds ago, it had been there. Now it was gone. Police arrived 7 minutes later, lights flashing, no sirens. Officers swept the property with flashlights, checking the perimeter, the fence line, the alley behind the house. They found no footprints, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the yard. David showed them the recording, pulling up the saved clip from 3:33 a.m. The officers watched in silence. One of them, a sergeant named Polk, replayed the footage 3 times, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what that is," he said finally, "but we'll file a report." Maria wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers, protection, explanations, but the look on Polk's face told her there were none. The family did not sleep for the rest of the night. By November 3rd, they had hired movers. By November 20th, they were gone, relocated to a rental property 2 counties away. The tooth, logged as evidence under case number 22 to 4471, was stored in the property room of the Dallas Police Department's North District Station. On November 15th, during a routine inventory check, the evidence bag was found empty. The seal was intact. The twine and black cloth were still inside, but the tooth was gone. No explanation was offered. No internal investigation was opened. The case was marked inactive. Maria Hernandez provided a final statement to police on November 22nd, recorded over the phone. In it, she described Lily's ongoing silence about Halloween, her refusal to discuss what happened, her nightmares that woke the house 3 times a week. But there was one detail Maria added at the end of the statement, her voice barely audible on the recording. "Every October," she said, "Lily draws the same picture. She won't talk about it, but she draws it over and over. A tall man standing at the end of our old driveway. He doesn't have a face, but he has a mouth, and the mouth is smiling, and it never ends. Ow. The file remains open in name only, stored in a digital archive accessible to officers with clearance. The Hernandez family has not returned to Maple Ridge Court. The house was sold in January 2023 to a family from out of state. They report no disturbances. But every Halloween, according to neighbors who still live on the street, the motion lights at the house trigger at 3:33 a.m. And every year, just before dawn, someone finds a small piece of black cloth on the front porch, tied with twine, empty but heavier than it should be.